I think we'll get started. Good morning, everybody. My name's Harvey Markovich, and I'm welcoming you to this session on research ethics and integrity. I should explain that the reason I stand here is because I'm the immediate past chair of an organisation called the Committee on Publication Ethics. And I need to just tell you a little of the background so that you understand how it introduces this particular session. This started off some 12 years ago, I guess, as what might be called a psychotherapeutic support group for editors of largely biomedical journals, mostly, but not exclusively, based in the UK, who had become aware of the fact that there was a significant, albeit small minority, of papers either submitted to their journals or published in their journals where there was a great suspicion of unethical or improper behaviour. And the problem for editors was not really knowing how to deal with this sort of issue. And if you come to think of it, editors are right at the end of the whole publication, the whole research process. And they often found themselves at the end of what had been probably a process that had lasted years, discovering problems. And the sort of problem that... is it going to go? Yes. The sort of problems that cropped up over those first 10 years, you can see on that slide. Now, I put in red the things which most people regard as the most serious misconduct on behalf of researchers, but you'll see that there are lots of other things as well, in many cases involving how subjects are dealt with, and also disputes that arise between authors and their institutions, authors and reviewers, and so on and so forth. And you might think, well, why is that of relevance to you as social scientists? And it's pretty straightforward, of course, because what's happened in the last 18 months is that this small group of friends who met every 3 months to discuss cases, and these were the cases that were so serious that they felt they were worth discussing at their 3-monthly meetings, has suddenly expanded into a much larger organisation of some 5,000 editors and publishers and others interested in the process, so that if there's anybody in this room who's an editor or on the editorial board or an officer of a society whose publication is published by Elsevier or Springer or Taylor and Francis or Wiley Blackwell, you're a member of COPE and you may not know it, and therefore you subscribe to COPE's Code of Conduct and COPE's best practice guidelines. And just to show you how that's come on, medicine is now a minority amongst the members of COPE, and you will see, for example, that there are some 385 journals in economics, finance, industry and business, and another 288 in psychology, social and behavioural sciences. There are even 19 astrophysicists who agree to abide by the code, and they may not realise it. The lesson or the message is that we have problems in biomedicine. There's no reason to believe you do not have problems elsewhere. So if I can now introduce our first speaker. Dr. Charlotte Haug is MD, PhD from Oslo. She has a master's degree in health services research from Stanford and is editor of the Journal of the Norwegian Medical Association. Previously, she was head of the section for specialised healthcare at the Norwegian National Board of Health, and she went on to supervise health policy research at Sintef Unimed, the largest independent research organisation in Scandinavia. She's a member of what's colloquially called the Vancouver Group, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. She's a council member of COPE. She's going to talk to us about research integrity and healthcare. Charlotte. We go out of there.
Or actually, Harvey, I'm just going to go on from where you were and talk about publication ethics and what I call the integrity of the scientific record. If I have seen further, it's only by standing on the shoulder of giants. Sir Isaac Newton was not the first to say this, of course, but he's probably the most often quoted saying this. The point is, of course, that science is a collective effort. Researchers are individuals, but they cannot do very much unless people have worked before them. And so they are extremely dependent on how that research is being done. Advances in science is very seldom made by single researchers or a single scientific papers. It's made by many scientists reviewing and discussing the scientific findings and the scientific literature. Interpretation of previous research is very much part of the scientific method. For those of you who attended Amartya Sen's lecture yesterday, he spent some part of that discussing Adam Smith and saying that he had been misunderstood, misinterpreted, and misused. Or, and quote, his work has not been absorbed in the literature correctly. In many ways, it doesn't help much what the researcher or the individual researcher or scientist does unless it is interpreted and communicated to others. So publication is integral to research. This was written in the Introduction to the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society in 1665, and I think it still holds true. There's nothing more necessary for promoting the improvement of science than a communication to those who apply their studies so that things are discovered or put into practice by others. The last part is also extremely important, put into practice by others. Drummond Rennie, who is famous in the medicine editor society, having spent much of his time working with publication ethics, says simply, science does not exist until it's published. So the principles of scientific communication, to communicate your observation to others, and then conduct further research based on those observations, and thus to create what we call the scientific record. And again, it's extremely important that just that record, that whole scientific literature, is as accurate and as good as it can be, because it's exactly that record that we're going to build on for further research, and it's exactly that record that we're going to apply when we're applying research in society. The quality and the integrity of the scientific record is thus dependent both on high quality research and of honest and high quality reporting of the results. I sort of made a circle here. You do research, it's interpreted and published, and then from that, new research will come. That means, of course, it's difficult enough to have good scientific literature and a good scientific record. And as Amartya Sen pointed out yesterday, for the 250 years since Adam Smith wrote the paper he was discussing yesterday, we had misunderstood anyway. We had misinterpreted. It's difficult enough when you do as well as you can. If there's fraud and misconduct in research and publication, that will seriously affect the scientific record. So, is it a problem? Is fraud and misconduct a problem in scientific publication? Harvey just mention that we have, in medicine, have been discussing this for quite a few years now, and we do find that there are problems. We being the editors. But many, many scientists, they disagree. They claim that science and the scientific community is self-regulating. They don't think that it's, they think it's rare. They think it will be detected by peers. They think it will be unacceptable for the scientific community, and so that the scientific literature is self-correcting. Again, I was thinking about that listening to Sen yesterday when we were talking about the market being self-regulating or self-correcting. Sadly, it's the same for science and the scientific literature. It's not the case. Harvey just named some of the types of publication misconduct that we can see. There is, of course, the outright fabrication and falsification or even theft of other people's data. There is plagiarism. There is publishing of unethical research. There's all kinds of authorships issues. That may not sound as a big thing. It's a big thing in medicine because there are so many authors often. But it is an important thing, because what is an author? An author is supposed to be the person taking responsibility for the science and the scientific literature. So if that's not the author, even if it's you're there as an author and you didn't write it, or you're not there, then that is taking some of the responsibility away. There's also all sorts of selective publication, duplicate publication, redundant publication, that is publications of the same thing over and over again, things that have already been published. There's also all kinds of reviewer and editor misconduct, by that meaning that, for instance, reviewers of papers, peer reviewers, steal the ideas from the papers they are reviewing, or that editors themselves put things in, or their own things in papers, all kinds of things. It is also right, as Harvey pointed out, that these first three are usually considered the most serious, and these other ones less serious. We have in medicine, just over the very recent years, have had some very high-profile cases, fabrication and falsification of data in the very, very best journals that have had implications in many directions. These high-profile cases has caused a lot of harm, to be sure, to the researchers themselves, to their institutions, to journals, but most importantly, patient or maybe future patients. In the case of Wang, for instance, there was lots of hope, and to the literature as a whole. If we look at the Wang case, he published 2 groundbreaking articles of stem cell research in the journal Science in 2004. And this raised a lot of hope and expectations from people, especially with a number of chronic diseases, as this was seen as a breakthrough for stem cell research. Well, it was found out that the data had been fabricated and the articles were retracted. And of course, Wang himself discredited all that. But by the time those articles were retracted, they had already been cited by more than 200 other articles. And half of these articles had been cited further, from 1 to 20 times. So his case is typical in the way that very, very serious fraud will most likely be found out sooner or later. And those scientific articles will be retracted, taken away. But other researchers continue to cite those articles still. So the information from these articles are already embedded in the scientific literature, in the scientific record. I will now go on to talk about the so-called less serious misconduct. May it be just as harmful. The authorship issues, the undeclared conflicts of interest, the selective, duplicate, redundant publications, all these other sort of minor things. It's only that these minor things all contribute to biased or selective reporting of the science in some way. In some way, in different ways, but in some way. I may also add to this less serious misconduct something that we don't really spend a lot of time in COPE on, but that is sort of lazy and sloppy reporting of science. That is also a kind of misconduct because it goes into the scientific record. So it's obvious that these very serious cases of misconduct is damaging to the scientific, to science and the scientific literature. But let's see now how these less serious acts can also do a lot of harm. What if the scientific literature in itself is biased? What if positive and welcome results are published fast and maybe published more than once, even if they were not found more than once? And unpopular or more boring results, if they're rarely published? Does it matter? I will give you an example that I have constructed from my own field, medicine. So let's say we want to see the effect of a new and promising drug, X. We do a trial A, and the trial is done, and it concludes that the drug X is a better pain reliever than standard care. And everything is well done, statistics are good, and the results are published in a major journal. And the conclusion, drug X, beneficial. And patients demand it and started receiving this new drug. It's nothing wrong here, really. It's nothing wrong with this article. But what if there were also very many other trials looking at the effect of this new drug X that we didn't know about and that showed different results? We might illustrate it graphically. So drug X blue, a better pain reliever. White has no effect. And sort of pinkish is actually harmful. So if we look only at trial A, we see blue. Yeah, drug X is a better pain reliever. But if you look at all the trials that were made and done, the picture is a bit more complicated. But what is if these others are never reported? This is what we would have liked to go into the scientific literature. This is not maybe what we're getting. This was bias, publication bias of trials. But you can also have, of course, publication bias within a single trial. Many of you will be familiar with the term data mining. You have a large data set with lots of variables, and you look for correlations among them, and you find significant correlations, whether they are true or not. You find a lot of things. When you look at your results, they're kind of confusing, or maybe they can look like this. All shades of colors. Very inconclusive what you really found here. But if you look closer, you might find these very interesting and statistically significant results. Something that's very beneficial in some way or another, or very dangerous, or whatever. If scientists report only the most striking and positive results, or only some of the results, they are not lying, but they're not telling the whole story. They're not doing really anything very, very wrong. But if the scientific community doesn't have the whole picture, they really don't have the picture at all. Publication fraud and misconduct. The major fraud, we don't, maybe from studies that are done, and how are they done? They are done by asking other scientists questions, and also, of course, by what is discovered. It's very serious. It's probably 2% of the cases. It's very serious for the individual, for the researcher, the institution. If it's discovered that you fabricated, falsificated, stolen data, plagiarized, that is very serious for you. But the minor fraud, the shortcuts, the duplicate, the selective reporting, the conflicts of interest, maybe that is, in the end, most serious for the integrity of the whole scientific record. And the problem seems to be increasing. Why? The honest and ethical reporting from research. It's important for science and the scientist, but most important for those benefiting or being harmed when the results are being applied on individuals or societies. Scientists know this. So why does fraud and misconduct happen? We like to think that we do science to find the truth and to advance knowledge, and of course we do that. But it also definitely promotes careers and attracts funding. The paradox is that the more successful research is, the more prone it seems to be to fraud and misconduct. And the medical research is a case in point. It's a lot of money involved in medical research. If you can get positive results on a new drug, it's an enormous profit to be gained. So what can be done? First, the first thing is to acknowledge that there actually is a problem, that publication bias, fraud, and misconduct are serious threats to the advancement of science. Second, that science, as a free market, isn't self-correcting. Third, that editors, as Harvey mentioned, as being sort of the last in line of the research project process, are not also should be aware of this, and should be aware that they are absolutely not perfect themselves, and they should follow ethical and practical codes of conduct and cooperate if possible. That has been the greatest achievement, I think, of COPE, is have a place to discuss. Editors otherwise are quite on their own. There are these international organizations that have started a lot of it in biomedicine, but has now expanded to all other areas. COPE, the Committee of Publication Ethics, as Harvey mentioned, is now by far the biggest one. Would you say, Harvey? CSE, the Council of Science Editors. Again, all types of science, not only medicine. They have made in 2006 a very good white paper on how to promote the integrity of the scientific journal publications. And then we have a small little group called the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, the Vancouver group. That is a small group, but has set standards for many years, actually for 30 years now, for the how to set standards for publication. That will be it. So finally, there needs to be increased quality and transparency in research and publication practices, increased awareness and knowledge on the part of readers and funders on research, and reassessment of the incentive maybe for scientific publication, maybe quality before quantity of publications. Fraud and misconduct in scientific publication, in addition to being unethical, it steals the time and resources of other researchers by misleading them when they base their own research on the scientific literature. It deteriorates the trust in research in society and in general, and it wastes money. I'll end like I started, with this quotation. If you have seen further, it's only by standing on the shoulder of giants. But it doesn't help to be standing on the shoulder of giants if the giants' feet are in mud. And when they fall, many will be tumbling down. Thank you.
Thank you. It's interesting, actually, because as time goes on, although these high-profile cases reach the press and things happen, Sudbo gets sent into provincial dental practice in Norway, which must be pretty severe. Perlman gets sent to prison, which is perhaps a little worse. Oh, he's out again, yes. Perlman gets sent to prison. But one's becoming increasingly aware that these cases, while spectacular, are relatively few, and that actually there's a much bigger undercurrent of other things going on that subtly distorts what we should be learning, and perhaps those things are more serious, and the question arises as to how to get to grips with them. Now, our second speaker is not, you'll be pleased to know, from the field of medicine, but Laura Smith-Doerr is Programme Director of Science, Technology and Society at the National Science Foundation in the US, and she's Associate Professor of Sociology at Boston University. Her published work is in the areas of organisational and economic sociology, science and society, and gender and work. And at NSF, she's also involved in the ethics education in science and engineering cross-NSF programme. She's going to talk to us on ethics education in the US and what is the role of social science. Laura. Oh yes, I've got the yellow card.
All right, so let me see if I can find my slides here. Great. Okay, so, excuse me, I'm going to be having two hats here. I'm going to be using my NSF hat, National Science Foundation, and my sociology researcher hat. But I also want to make sure that you realize that these are my own opinions and they don't represent the NSF or Boston University or anybody else except for me. So one thing I've noticed as I've gotten involved with the ethics education community is that in the United States, at least, ethics education in science and engineering has been traditionally led by applied philosophers and ethicists. And so they're the teachers, and the students are medicine people, natural scientists, and engineers. And social scientists have largely been left out of the picture. However, there are some social scientists who have added to the discussion by looking empirically at how do scientists actually behave. So we have some statistics that I'll show on each of those different areas of misconduct. And social scientists have also conducted some critical analysis of the ways that science as an institution itself has issues. And so the way that social science approaches ethics education, I'm going to argue, is important because we need those empirical and critical edges and tools in order to understand how best to do ethics education, in order to hopefully prevent some of the things down the line that Charlotta was talking about in the published literature. So I hope this presentation will be an opportunity to discuss how social science can respond to mandates that we now get involved in ethics education, at least in the United States. We're now being required as social scientists, if we want federal funding, to educate our students in research ethics. So we have to pay attention, and I think that's a good thing in some ways, if we do it right. So I'm going to be talking about my data from my research, which is also actually on the life sciences, and the interviews that I've done with life scientists in the US, in Italy, and the UK. And I'm also going to take a brief detour into my experiences at NSF as a policymaker, right? So I got pulled into how are we going to deal with these new congressional mandates for ethics education at NSF. So I am mostly going to be talking about the US case, but I do think it has some implications for other social science around the world. All right, so I said what we can offer is empirical research. This is some data from Melissa Anderson and colleagues. This is self-report behavior by life scientists who have been funded by the National Institutes of Health. And as you can see, I think that the percentages are actually higher than what Charlotta said. Maybe it's just in the US. But right here, this is a little hard to see, but this first bar is falsification, fabrication, and plagiarism. And so an important thing to keep in mind here is this is a survey where people were asked to report, have you falsified, fabricated, or plagiarized work in the last year? One out of 1,000 life scientists admitted to this. So it looks small, but this is, I think this could actually add up to something big over time. And then what Anderson and colleagues call questionable research practices include things like, have you dropped observations based on a gut feeling that they are inaccurate? That's the data. The methods that you've used, have they been inadequate or inappropriate research design? Policy, for example, is have you had relationships with students or subjects that have been questionable? Funds, using funds from one project to do work on another. Influence is not properly disclosing involvement in firms whose products are based on your research. Peer review, have you done inappropriate or careless review of papers or proposals, which is also relevant for the scientific literature. Credit, have you inappropriately assigned authorship? Cutting corners, have you signed a form without reading it completely? So you can see that that's most everybody. Okay, then they also asked people, which was pretty ingenious, have you seen your colleagues do these things? And the numbers are a lot higher.
Well, what are
yeah.
the differences between the two bars?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, thank you. So the first bar is the mid-career scientists, and the second bar is the early career life scientists, right? So there are some differences between mid-career, those are people who have had their major NIH grants already, and then the earlier career life scientists. Okay, so maybe, and you'll notice that falsification, fabrication, and plagiarism that's the biggest difference right there. And so almost half of all life scientists have observed someone doing that. Maybe they all observed the same person. They all knew Sudbo or something, but it's probably unlikely. Okay, so empirical analysis is important. That's something social science can offer. We can also offer critical theory and analysis. So I would characterize my work as part of this body of literature. Other social scientists have looked at this too. Just one example, John Evans has looked at bioethics narratives and how they became increasingly narrow over the life of the Human Genome Project in the United States. My research also looks at the life sciences, and I was really interested in understanding how scientists themselves respond to the increasingly routinized version of ethics education that they received. In the US, it's often packaged as a module on a website that you take a multiple choice questionnaire at the end. So it's not very thorough, I would say. So in this research, I analyzed my data inductively. I allowed life scientists in the US, Italy, and the UK to tell me what research ethics policies were most salient to their work and education of students that worked in their labs. And so in their responses, what I found in the US was, I began interviewing in 2001, they were referring to a mandate in 2000 which required scientists funded by the National Institutes of Health, NIH, that if they worked with human biological materials, that they had to be certified as educated in ethics. And with Italian scientists that I interviewed beginning in 2004, they noted that there weren't any national level requirements in Italy, but they discussed the European Commission's framework program, which was FP6 from 2002, and there, in order to propose a research project to the framework program, you had to discuss a broad range of ethical issues, including research ethics in the proposals. They talked about that. In the UK, I began interviews also in 2004, and they discussed the 2003 requirement for research council studentships, and so they were talking about the medical research council because they were life scientists. Excuse me. And in which they had to log the coursework for their graduate students, and often that included transferable skills, and transferable skills courses can be a wide range of things, but they often included some kind of research ethics training for the students. Okay, the commonality there was they all disliked the ethics policies and what they felt were the routines for ethics education, but they had different discourses of dislike. In the UK, there was, I'll give you an example from a 2005 interview. One professor in the UK was describing something that I found to be typical among them. They wanted to wait and see what was going to happen after the current leadership of the Medical Research Council had left. So at that time, Colin Blakemore was the head of the MRC. And so this particular person said, quote, "Colin Blakemore, the new head of the MRC, seems just as dictatorial as the last head. He dismantled the system of his predecessor. There are now more individual investigator initiatives in the granting system. Scientists are happy, but the project grants have been largely abandoned. The larger group theme, where you become a member of a group and get grants, these cooperatives meant fewer grants to individuals. These were set up, but have been disenfranchised. They lasted not quite 10 years. So this interviewee was using that as an example to say, well, we'll wait and see what happens with these transferable skills courses, including the research ethics. Maybe when the next person comes in to head the MRC, then we won't have to do it anymore. So that was a typical kind of reaction that I found. A little bit of skepticism, I would say, in the UK. In Italy, Italian scientists spoke about the European context and the goal of obtaining resources outside of their very limited national funding system. So they talked about the European Commission policies, the Framework Program 6. So in order to do these large scientific projects, they're very complex coordination between multiple countries. But also in the proposals, in case you don't know, European scientists have to write a chapter in their project applications on the practical management of ethics in the project, which includes ethics education for researchers and also review by ethics committees. And they also had to discuss the implications of their research in these proposals for dignity, privacy, and integrity of persons, biodiversity in the environment, animal welfare, balanced science technology discourse in the media, and the integration of Europe. So Italian scientists seemed mystified by these kinds of requirements. And so one professor that I spoke with had this to say, quote, "When you have to write an application for the EC, you have to keep in touch with agencies that know how to write these proposals. It is so complicated. There are some questions and forms we do not even know what they are asking." That was probably the integration in Europe piece. But so this professor is noting that there's contract research firms that aid in writing EC proposals, especially the ethics pieces and the integration of Europe and so forth pieces. And so, as one other respondent put it, the ethics have become outsourced, really, in this context. Finally, in the US, the respondents expressed distaste and dislike for what they saw as a government top-down imposed education policy, and particularly its website training implementation. So one scientist, who was this very cheerful guy, who had a lot of experience in administration and in industry, as well as academia, saw the ethics education requirement as part of a larger, inefficient trend towards bureaucracy. And so he wasn't smiling when he said, "That's a lot of why I retired when I did, because of all that kind of rigmarole. If you haven't learned what's right and wrong by the time you reach my age, then no module is going to teach you." I saw this kind of thing coming even in industry, of course. It's the ones at the top of the company who are caught doing something, but then the order comes down that everyone needs to go through education in ethics to learn not to do what's wrong. And then so he rolled his eyes and he said, "Ha!" but very sarcastically. And this kind of dismissive affect I found common in the interviews with US scientists. So they rolled their eyes a lot. They made, these kinds of noises that showed that they really were sort of disgusted and ridiculing the way that ethics education had been implemented and that they were forced to endure. So what were they talking about? If you haven't seen this, here's one example of a page from that website implementation. I don't know if you can read this, but I'll just read the bottom one for you. So you have to match the definition. I've already done it on here, but you have to match the definition to the term. So the last one is, "The burdens and benefits of research should be fairly distributed among individuals, groups, societies, etc." And the answer there is justice. And I met students that bragged that they could go through this without reading any of the materials in 15 minutes and, get the certificate that they're educated in ethics. So that's what they were dismissive of, this kind of implementation. Okay. So why do we care? Scientists complain a lot about a lot of things. Why should we listen to their complaints about ethics education? Well, as social scientists, we worry about unanticipated consequences. And so one of the people I interviewed also noted that these kinds of requirements, she was someone who cared about these things deeply and thought that her research should do things to better society in general, and she wanted to have substantive discussions about ethics. And these, very narrow requirements are actually, not helpful for people who want to have more substantive discussion. So she said, they're basically hoops to jump through, but universities could make these courses relevant. These are problems that really happen, as Charlotta noted. The trouble is making them requirements does not make them popular. And then she went on to talk about how making these particular kinds of narrow requirements are especially unhelpful. So what I worry about is that younger generations of scientists will come to associate ethics with these kinds of very narrow implementations that they view as silly. And also Melissa Anderson in her research has noted that these kinds of traditional ethics training that scientists have received have little or no effect on their behavior. So they're just as likely to engage in questionable research practices whether or not they've had ethics training. And what Melissa and her colleagues have found is that mentoring is the thing that's most effective, right? So not going through a course that's completely separate from your life in the lab, which is not surprising because we know that education that's effective engages people in what they do in their daily life. And so what she found is that mentoring is really important. It can help people engage in more research integrity if it's good mentoring. But mentoring can also have very negative effects on research integrity behavior, so that if students are told science is competitive and getting the next grant is the most important thing that we need to do in this lab, and I don't care how we get this grant application out the door, but we need it out now, then that has a negative effect on research integrity. So thinking about the unanticipated consequences is really important. It's something that social science can contribute. All right, so as I said at the beginning, social science has got to start paying attention to these things. I've been talking about life scientists, but what about social science? What are we going to do now that we're required, at least in the US? This is a congressional mandate from the America Competes Act. That requires that NSF proposals, all NSF proposals, including social science proposals, must have appropriate training and oversight in responsible and ethical conduct for undergraduate, graduate students, and postdoctoral researchers. So what do? We could send people to the existing routines. There are websites out there. We could say, go take those courses and be done like that. We could be very efficient. But I would argue, and thanks Charlotta for a great introduction, that we can't do that because it's just too important. And to be efficient is not the right approach. To be effective is much more important here. So what have I done? I've gotten involved in this policy committee. The first thing I did was to fund a workshop and involved philosophers. So people have thought about this from an ethics perspective, also social scientists and natural scientists and engineers and graduate students and postdocs to think about this important question. And what do we know? How can we approach this in a productive way? And so this is my version of what they came up with. The final report is not yet out. It should be on the National Academy's website any day now. But one thing that they noted is that something we know in social science, we need to pay attention to the context. If we have rotten apples but aren't looking at the rotten barrel, then we're not going to be fixing the problems. So paying attention to what are the incentives and focusing on quality over quantity perhaps might be part of this. Is important. Another thing discussed was that online-only training, so these modules that are separate from research life, is not an effective way to teach ethics education. However, online resources can be very helpful and important. And so what was recommended at this workshop was that there should be a clearinghouse for all of the resources that are already out there that are good resources. Maybe COPE would be part of this, but having resources that are online that can be helpful for faculty, for students who want to approach ethics education in a deeper way and looking at what has been effective in the past. Also, we know that, as I said before, mentoring is really important, and faculty must be involved in. They can't just outsource the ethics. We know that doesn't work. So what have we done at NSF so far? As I said, we had a workshop. We also encourage proposers to talk about responsible research practices in their proposals. We published our approach in the Federal Register, which is where in the US we put, all the federal agencies put their policies, and in order to get the community's input. And just this last week, the awards finally went through for the first 2 sites for the Clearinghouse of Resources. So the National Academies is going to have one, and the University of Massachusetts at Amherst will have another site, 2 different approaches to trying to build the foundation for a larger clearinghouse of information that will be open to everyone, and that I hope will be also very international as well as US based. Okay, this makes it sound kind of cheerful, but I have to say it wasn't easy to get policy moving along the path that's informed by social science. I don't have a lot of time, so I won't go into the details, but I think something I think about has my critical edge been lost? My researcher hat affected by my policymaker hat? Have I been co-opted by engaging in this? And I think that keeping those reflexive impulses in mind is going to be really important for social science if we are going to engage in policy processes. But I think it's also really important. So, just to restate, what I've been trying to argue here is that social science is going to have a role in ethics education, whether it likes it or not, because of the requirements. I'm arguing we shouldn't passively take institutionalized approaches to ethics for granted, but we should use our tools, our empirical research, and our critical theory to help develop more effective ways to ensure research integrity, because it's so important. So, thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. I didn't even have to use the yellow card. That's fantastic. There is a small warning for social scientists that I should like to issue, and I'm glad you interviewed people rather than produce questionnaires. There's a paper in the Journal of Medical Ethics published, I think, in 2004 by a chap called Begbie, who sort of tried to duplicate the work of Martinson in that he asked medical researchers in his particular area whether they'd committed any form of misconduct. And I can't remember the figures, but a tiny proportion did. But he then asked another question, which was, do you intend to commit misconduct in the future? And 6 times as many said yes. And I think that tells you something about the British sense of humour. So be careful when you do research in the UK. Our next speaker is Dr. Jocelyn Clark. And Jocelyn is a senior editor at PLOS Medicine, published by the Public Library of Science. She's assistant professor in the Department of Medicine at the University of Toronto in Canada. Well, I didn't really need to say it was in Canada, but I will. Her PhD is in public health science, and she worked at the University of Toronto, focusing on access to care, gender and performance measurement. She has written extensively in the areas of global health, women's health, equity, and the social context of health and healthcare. I had the pleasure with working with her when we were both associate editors of the BMJ, and she's going to talk about what I regard as a terribly important subject. In medicine, we know that financial conflicts of interest have a big impact on research conduct. There may be millions of dollars at stake in a drug trial, and if you're looking for problems, as we all know, you should follow the money. But there is a much wider and much more subtle and much more, at least to me, interesting area of competing interest, and that has to do with non-financial competing interests. And that's what I would like to ask Jocelyn to talk about.
Well, good thing I prepared slides on that very topic,
Yep.
Harvey.
Yeah, you could have done anything extemporary if you had.
Yes, of course. Well, thank you so much, Harvey, for inviting me to participate, and to all of you for joining us this morning. And I'm delighted to go last, actually, because I think the background that both Charlotte and Laurel provided is going to be very useful as I talk to you and argue that non-financial competing interests are as important, if not more important. And I hope that, despite us coming back to the medical field, that some of what I talk about today will resonate with all of you who perhaps work outside of medicine, and also for us who are interested and involved in managing non-financial competing interests, that there's lots for us to learn from those of you who work in more social scientific or policy domains. So I'm going to take the case of medical journals because that is the area in which I've largely worked since I escaped academia full-time about 7 years ago when I went to the British Medical Journal. But they are a terribly important forum. They are, as Charlotte argued, a main venue for publication of medical research, and they're absolutely crucial for career advancement and academic merit. Publication sort of makes the world go round. I don't need to convince you of that. Medical journals are widely read and circulate internationally. They tend to get a lot of media pickup. So their content can be very influential. It's generally thought of as being associated with a great prestige and credibility. And because we're working in areas that have implications for patient care, the content we publish in medical journals can have an impact on both policy and practice. So these issues that we're raising here around the integrity of the literature become very, very important in medicine when it might have an impact on how we care for our patients. And I'd like to emphasize the gatekeeper role that journal editors play, because we are this last step in the research process. It's quite remarkable how standards and expectations that we have as editors for researchers in reporting the research in an honest and ethical way can often raise questions actually about the ethical conduct and integrity of the research itself. Conflicts of interest in healthcare arise when clinicians or researchers have personal, professional, financial interests that could interfere with or be perceived to interfere with their primary obligation, which is to act in the best interests of their patients, or to objectively conduct and publish the results of their research. For those of us who work in medical journalism, conflicts of interest are important when an author, or indeed the author's institution, a reviewer or an editor, has financial or personal relationships that might bias their actions about a particular scientific paper. Even the language around conflicts of interest has changed recently, and we sometimes, almost now exclusively, call them competing interests in a way to sort of neutralize the thoughts about them. So I'll use these two terms interchangeably. We tend to categorize competing interests in two ways. One is the financial, and which I'll argue is the more dominant concern among those of us who work in this industry, and that can include employment, stock holdings, patents, paid consultancies, board memberships, research grants, gifts that tie one financially to an entity that might benefit from the publication of research. Non-financial competing interests, which I'm going to talk about a great deal more, exist in the personal, the non-commercial realm, which might include your relationships with people, which might include academic competition or rivalry, which might involve your activity as a lobbyist or a member of a group that may or may not benefit from publication of your research. Why do competing interests matter? In two main ways. First, because they may indeed have a profound effect on your judgment, and two, because of the perception that a person's judgment may be affected, whether it is or not. And we're very concerned about this in medical journals because we believe the very credibility of the editorial process depends upon these conflicts of interest being properly managed. And I can't say that we do that, but this is what we're hoping for. But as the other panelists have argued, and indeed those who work more broadly than simply the publication of research argue, that actually conflicts of interest have a real impact on not just publication, but on medical research more generally, on medical education, and on clinical practice. The Institute of Medicine, which is a large American body, independent body that guides and promotes evidence-based medicine, last week released a report, a very comprehensive report, that asserted that we need to stop unacceptable conflicts of interest, and that they have the effect of threatening, in fact, the integrity of the medical profession, that they can have the effect of eroding public trust in science, and that, in fact, they do so at the same time not providing any meaningful benefit to patients or society. Their recommendations included, among other things, to improve the disclosure of financial ties between the medical community and industry, to limit, if not abolish, gifts that drug companies, for example, make to researchers and authors, and to remove the involvement of industries, the pharmaceutical industry, the medical device industry being the two most dominant players, in the creation and delivery of medical education and in the creation of clinical guidelines. So here's an example from the world of medical editing to illustrate to you how financial competing interests are important. This is a scenario involving an author. We commission, perhaps, or we receive a manuscript from an author who has written a review about the treatments for high blood pressure, and in it, he emphasizes that ABC drugs are the best. But this author holds stock in the ABC drug company, which competes with many other companies to sell antihypertensive drugs. So if this financial tie were undisclosed, the editor or the readers reading this review article would judge that that author's discussion of the various treatment options for hypertension were objective and balanced. So the idea here is that their financial interest would compete with their ability to review this objectively, whether they believe that that's true or not. These also arise in the case of reviewers who we depend very heavily upon for the peer review, the quality control of the content that we publish in medical journals. This reviewer wishes to stay anonymous, submits a review in which she recommends rejecting the paper. But this reviewer is currently developing a similar technology to that which is reported in the paper, and she plans a patent claim, which of course depends on the invention being justified as being original, so therefore cannot have no prior art. Conceivably, her desire to suppress disclosure of this technology in this paper might bias her against providing a professional and objective review. And keep in mind that by asking to remain anonymous, she has had access to, without disclosing such, that she's had access to the confidential material contained in this paper, which may then disclose her own interests. Those are two scenarios, but how common are competing interests? One of the most often quoted studies is a systematic review that was published in 2003 in the Journal of the American Medical Association, in which Carrie Gross and colleagues reviewed a large number of articles and found that 1/4 of American researchers have received pharmaceutical funding for their research. Half of them had received research-related gifts. This might include things like trips or materials, equipment, this sort of thing. A full third of lead authors in the articles in major medical journals had financial interests in their research. They found 11 studies that compared the outcomes of the research of industry-sponsored studies with non-industry sponsored studies. And those that had been sponsored by industry were 4 times more likely to have findings favorable to the industry than the non-industry sponsored studies. One other example that's often quoted is a paper by Lisa Barrow and her colleagues that looked at the influence of the tobacco industry on the outcomes of research. They found 106 reviews. These were systematic reviews that looked at the influence, the impact of secondhand smoking on health outcomes. 37% of these reviews concluded that secondhand smoke was not harmful. The only factor associated with the conclusion of these reviews was whether the author was affiliated with the tobacco industry. And only less than 1/4 of these reviews disclosed that in fact the tobacco industry had funded this work, which was largely, if it was funded by them, largely looking like it was concluding in favor of the industry. there are many others, and because of this growing evidence base about how one's financial affiliations might actually affect the conclusions of your research, a number of bodies have developed policies on competing interests. Lots of governments now, professional associations, funders have now developed policies on competing interests. But the ones that tend to have real teeth for researchers in the field come from their own universities, but in particular those that define expectations when it comes to publication. So journal policies, both us as individual journals and as groups of journals and editors, have developed policy that define what we see as relevant competing interests, what we're expecting from authors and reviewers, and what penalties would arise if competing interest policies were not formed. So Harvey and Charlotte talked about COPE, which has developed a set of codes of conduct and best practice guidelines. The Vancouver group has developed a very influential policy. And the third body, CSE, the fourth body, which has recently developed a more robust competing interest policy, is the World Association of Medical Editors, WAMI. But there's lots of criticism of these policies. The ones that emanate from funders and associations have been criticized for not going far enough, and in particular not acting on their policies. Two very recent reports have criticized the NIH, which does have an existing policy. The NIH is the major, as you know, public funder of research in America. And the US FDA, which is the main regulator of drugs and medical devices, has very recently, by America's own Department of Health and Human Services, has been criticized for doing too little to identify and mitigate the impact of these financial interests among people in America who are doing clinical trials. The other criticism is that they focus largely on financial ties, and that they exclude editors, that they tend to focus more on authors and reviewers and faculty members than they do editors themselves. Non-financial competing interests have received very little attention, but the sort of mythology among editors is that these in fact are very widespread and that they can be more potent than financial interests. I'm sure any of you who have worked as editors might agree that non-financial personal interests in fact can lead to bad publication behavior. And that can include very simple things like when you submit a manuscript to a journal, you recommend as reviewers people with whom you've worked, with whom you're friendly, that sort of thing, as a way to sort of game the system. Equally, though, we see people who, as in my scenario case, request that their review not have their name attached to it and provide a sort of negative review that appears to go beyond merely a review of the science, but instead takes on a tone, sometimes even a sort of nastiness that suggests that there is an agenda. And also, I think one way in which we see a sort of lack of concern or acknowledgement of non-financial interests is that when we ask people to declare their competing interests, we ask them to reflect on who might benefit from the publication of their paper. They tend to limit their discussions of that to financial ones. And indeed, lots of journals have tried to manage or mitigate non-financial competing interests. The BMJ, a journal that Harvey and I have both been affiliated with, tried very hard to include non-financial competing interests in their standard competing interest policy, but abandoned it because it simply was unworkable. The major journals in the field, JAMA, Nature Medicine, the New England Journal of Medicine, Science, none of them have policies that even acknowledge that private interests might exist. And as I mentioned, WAMI, whose editorial policy committee I sit on, recently revised their competing interest policy but abandoned including non-financial interests because the majority view of the committee was that they were indeed too nebulous and unquantifiable. So let me talk a little bit more about what we define as non-financial competing interests and how they operate in practice. This is based upon an editorial I wrote very recently in the new journal I work at, PLOS Medicine. Non-financial interests are sometimes called private interests, and they can be personal, they can be political, academic, ideological, or religious. Like financial interests, they can influence professional judgment. None of us are surprised that everyone holds a private interest that might influence the reporting of their research, because these tend to be the sort of things that actually fuel our passions and our careers. They're the very reason that we choose the research interests that we have. And we know that in the academic sphere, these types of views, this type of competition, indeed is sort of the lifeblood, if you will. So here's a non-financial example along the lines of the scenarios I described earlier, and it's the sort of thing we see all the time. So an author writes a review of the treatments of depression and emphasizes in his review the failings of all the body of research on SSRIs, which is a treatment for depression. But that author is a long-standing member of a contemporary religious organization that believes that psychiatric drugs should not be used at all for mental health issues. If that interest goes undisclosed, again, the editor or the readers of this paper would judge this person's review of the treatments for depression as being objective and balanced. So their personal interest here, just like their financial interest, might compete with their ability to review the field objectively. Again, a reviewer who wishes to stay anonymous submits a critical review in which she recommends rejecting the paper. She doesn't necessarily have a financial interest, but her group competes for the same funding, probably the same profile, the same media attention with this group with whom she has scientific disagreements. So her academic rivalry, which here it could be undisclosed, conceivably could bias her against providing a collegial and objective review. And again, the fact that she has had access to the research might further her own interest. I'd like to give you an example of an editor, because we tend not to acknowledge that editors themselves have private interests that may affect the work. And this has been heavily criticized by researchers and authors in the field who are subject to new policies. But this sort of thing happens all the time. I think this is a perfect example because I've seen it happen so often. An editor is assigned a paper from the same research group in which he did his postdoc. He chooses kind reviewers and fights hard for the paper in the editorial meeting. He may have an interest to get his old supervised paper published because maybe they're still friends, maybe they write papers together, maybe they go to the pub together still every Thursday night. Perhaps that researcher is organizing a meeting in Bergen and that researcher would like an invitation. That interest may compete with that editor's objective appraisal of the paper's suitability for the journal. But let me tell you about the problems about this. I mean, number one, everybody has competing interests. That's something that we all need to acknowledge. They can be financial, they most certainly can be private, or they can be both. Indeed, the very best reviewers, the best authors, even maybe the best editors in a particular field will have some type of non-financial competing interest. So that when I ask, the top malarial researcher in a particular field of malarial research to look at a paper that has been submitted to my journal, and I ask her to review our competing interest policy and declare her competing interests, she very well may say, I'm a direct competitor. Who could review this paper, who is not? There's a lot of resistance to disclosure, and it's not limited to reviewers and authors. Indeed, those examples of editors handling papers of people that they're colleagues with, also it invokes a lot of resistance to disclosure because people feel that their sort of personal, political, scientific views are private and confidential, and by asking people to disclose those, we're somehow encroaching on people's privacy. And indeed, this is not limited to non-financial competing interests, but comes up very, very strongly when you ask people to declare their non-financial competing interests, that people feel that they can reliably judge their own biases, which, of course, we know is not to be true. Competing interests are for others to judge, not your own. And of course, there's sort of a resistance because of concern that we'll be criticized, that having competing interests makes us seem wicked or bad, or worse among academics, a charge that they're being ideological. So it's this sort of criticism that can stop people from being open. As I said, lots of institutions have developed competing interest policies. PLOS Medicine, the journal I'm affiliated with, has just undertaken a comprehensive review of our competing interest policy because we're very determined to include non-financial competing interests. And so I'd like to suggest 3 solutions that we're hoping for. The first is disclosure. I can't remember who said this, but it's repeated all over the place, that disclosure is almost a panacea. And that is sort of almost the base level expectation with competing interests. And so as journals, we need to provide explicit definitions and clear guidance and expectations around disclosure, and be very clear with people that declaring competing interests does not mean that their paper won't be published or that they won't be used as a reviewer. And we need to request disclosure at multiple stages because as probably is seen in lots of cases of research misconduct, people are asked to review policies, are asked to sign declarations that they've read policies that define codes of conduct, etc., and yet continue to ignore them. We publish competing interests, and we require at PLOS Medicine editors to declare their own competing interests, and we post them on our website for public access. So these include things like we require authors and reviewers to disclose their unpaid board, governmental or committee memberships, their political or religious affiliations, any relevant personal relationships. So that includes things like if they sit on our editorial board, if they've served as an expert witness. Reviewers, in addition, are expected to tell us if they're asked to review a paper, if they have held grants, co-authored papers, or worked in the same institution as any of the authors of the study they're reviewing. Second, more research. Very, very little research has been done on non-financial competing interests, despite the fact that all of us who deal with them feel that they're terribly widespread. And that's probably why we have tended as journals to worry about financial competing interests, because they are easier to define and regulate. So we need more information on the extent of this problem and what impact they have. But let me tell you about a couple of studies which I found quite fascinating. This one comes from the area of clinical psychology. It was a systematic review by a group of authors about 10 years ago. And they found that a researcher's allegiance to a given school of thought in psychotherapy exerted a bias on the study design and outcomes of research in psychotherapy that was comparable to that which had been documented for financial interests. So that included things like choosing a comparator that was much less effective than the drug of or the therapy of their choice, downplaying the results of the comparator, and not publishing negative data on the treatment of their choice. There has been some research on the editorial process. Goldsmith and his colleagues looked at a number of manuscripts that had been submitted to a dermatology journal and found that the odds of acceptance were twice for manuscripts for which authors had excluded reviewers than those who hadn't. And that means that if you submit a manuscript and you're successful in getting an editor not to send your paper to your rival, you're more likely to get your paper published. People know they're assassins, is how the author was quoted. And there are 2 separate studies that suggested the same thing by our colleagues Sarah Schroeder and Liz Wager, which support this idea that reviewers favorably biased toward the authors are more likely to recommend acceptance and less likely to advocate rejection than reviewers that are chosen by editors. So in practice, I think probably a lot of editors would agree that when despite the fact that we often ask authors to recommend reviewers, we very often don't use them because we know that they're they work down the hall from the author, or they're married to the author, or that sort of thing. And thirdly and finally, more policy development. There's lots of calls for more harmonized approaches to managing competing interests in general, but we need to do the same for non-financial. We can't, as journals, police non-financial competing interests, but nor can we do the same thing with financial. But what we can do is develop clear and explicit policies for authors, reviewers, and editors. And because the Vancouver group is an influential group and they meet annually, they probably should reconsider rediscussing non-financial competing interests. And the WAMI policy that I was involved in developing probably needs to be revised because it has been criticized. And also this Institute of Medicine report that I mentioned that came out last week to a lot of fanfare actually said that the World Association of Medical Editors needs to take this on. We need to continue to promote more transparency. It's in the best interests of readers and the scientific record. And that as editors ourselves, we're not beyond reproach, but we need to acknowledge that we have our own competing interests, and that in assuming leadership on the issue, we need to disclose those ourselves. A load of questions remain about this issue. How close is too close with private interests? Those of us who work in health and medicine probably recognize that that a governmental agency, an international body like the UN bodies, have interest in the outcomes of their research in the same way that commercial companies have interest in their research, but they are largely excluded from these competing interest policies. And we need to fine-tune some of these regulations, and I look forward to a discussion about how that might be done.
Thank you. I'm glad you ended with the comment about editors not being beyond reproach. As an editor, it's ever so easy to choose reviewers who are either going to be doves or hawks, and achieve the result that you want, of course. Well, the floor is open to discussion, and if anyone would like to make some observations or ask questions, please come up to the microphone and say who you are and go ahead, please.
Ben Martin from Spru at the University of Sussex, and I'd like to thank the three presenters for very excellent presentations. I'm only sad that we have here only 5% or so of the audience for this conference. I think this is a topic that actually we should all be listening to. Until 2 years ago, I was in the camp that I think Charlotte described as believing that incidents of misconduct was rare. Self-policing worked. When it caught people, that put an end to it. But 2 years ago, I, as an editor of a journal, came across a case which proved to be the tip of an enormous iceberg, which has led me to challenge all those assumptions. But there are three things I wanted to take up. One, I think, Charlotte, you said let me get the quote, very serious fraud will most likely be found out sooner or later. How do we know? In Rumsfeld's terms, this is a known unknown. We know about detected misconduct. We don't know about the prevalence of undetected fraud that's still out there. Second question. There was an observation, I think, in one or more of the presentations, that the problem seems to be increasing. It may be, or it may be just that the detection is increasing. Again, we don't know. We know some parallels with the world of students. We're catching more plagiarism among students, but it doesn't necessarily mean there's more plagiarism going on. It's just it's easier for us to detect it. Maybe now we're a bit more sensitive as editors, as reviewers, to this misconduct, and we're detecting more of it. Third question, a bit more controversial perhaps, and maybe Laurel Smith-Dorr might like to address it. Most of the cases of misconduct that I'm familiar with seem to have involved male researchers, with one or two exceptions. We know that our prisons are not 50% men and 50% women. They're rather, I'm not sure what the proportion is, but it's not that. Is the same true in the world of academic research? And if so, why? why are there more men at the extremes of behaviour here? So 3 questions.
Well, that's given us something to think of. I think one of the problems, of course, is that incidence and prevalence are very difficult to determine in this area, and although some of the software systems for detecting plagiarism are beginning, and duplicate publication are now giving us a handle on how much of the literature is corrupt in that way, it's very difficult to know whether any potential increase is just due to the fact that despite predictions to the contrary, there are more and more medical journals and more papers being published. There's some interesting questions there. Who wants to kick off? What about that last question, which was so fascinating?
Yeah.
Have you got some theories?
Okay, so I'm going to go back to the empirical research, right? And so Melissa Anderson and her colleagues have found in their surveys that when you look just at the general descriptive statistics, that there is indeed a gender effect, that men are more likely to admit to bad behavior. But when you control, right, it's regression analysis. When you control for other things, like does the researcher collaborate with industry, then the gender effect disappears. So again, going back to competing interests, maybe we know men are more likely to patent. I've done a little bit of research on that myself. And so there may be some effect of commercialization, which I sort of alluded to, but I didn't get into in my talk. But I think this is a really fascinating question, and I think that thinking about ethics in narrower terms, like just sort of counting falsification, fabrication, and plagiarism, that maybe we're not seeing the whole picture, and I think what we really need is an understanding of how scientists think about their work and what ends it's getting them to, and I think there is some gendered differences there that is actually my next research project, so thanks.
Do either of the others want to comment, Charlotte? Or on any of the other questions?
Yeah. So do we know if it's increasing, and do we know if we're getting at it? I think it has to do with the definition. So when I said, the very serious things will get caught, I think I'm still maybe right. But then again, depends on if we're talking about all kinds of fabrication and small falsifications, then we're absolutely not knowing anything. And from what you were showing, it's terrible. Is it increasing? Again, we have to guess. Then I think we have to go back to the incentives for research and why we are doing it, and think a lot about that, because it's why are we in this situation? Why are we here? That we're, you would think that people are, sitting around in Greece, sort of talking about the truth, But here, people want to have careers, money, grants, and it has to happen quickly. These things.
Yes, you had a question, at the gentleman at the back.
My name is Jan Raad. I'm from the University of Amsterdam. Let me first make a statement. I'm incredibly anti-misconduct and incredibly pro-ethical behavior. But I think that the same holds for all of us here. But the solution that seems to crop up all the time, namely that we need more rules and that these rules need to be applied seriously, also leads to numerous perverse effects. And this sort of recalls the German Democratic Republic. Also a situation in which there was a lot of perceived misconduct. Nobody knew how widespread it was, but the more intense searches were made, the more cases were found. But we also know that in that time there were a lot of effects that sort of undermined the intentions. So for instance, there's at least three problems. If reviewers want me to state my political or religious or views or whatsoever, I'm not interested in reviewing anymore, because I'm not in this game to write those kind of statements. I'm interested in other kinds of stuff, apart from the question that it takes too much time. Secondly, it may lead to strategic behavior. If my membership of a political organization, of a lobby group, would be a problem, and I'm really insistent that particular types of research should be blocked, then I stop being a member. But it doesn't mean that I stop having that convictions and that strategic behavior. And thirdly, and that's maybe the biggest problem that I have, that if everybody would play the game as the rules would say, that means that particular types of research will not be done. How about studying criminal behavior? And if you need to get consent of people, everybody interested needs to be taken account with. That kind of research is no longer possible. How do we deal with that?
I don't think I can comment on your last piece because I'm by no means an expert on ethical guidelines for research in general. I would probably think that at my medical journal we would not be interested on research with subjects who had not given consent, whether they were criminals or not. But to your first 2 points, I mean, these are criticisms that we've heard a lot before, but I'll give you an example, and that is that one's affiliation with an organization that has public views on matters of health and medicine become terribly important when you're asked to be an expert reviewing a set of evidence that has the implication of changing patient care. So the example I used of the depression review is a real one, that this person was a Scientologist, was not revealed to editors or readers, but is an important part of the picture, that their view and judgment that they use to review the massive evidence on treatments of depression becomes important because they have taken a public view and have taken a public membership in an organization that rejects antidepressant drugs. So as editors, we would argue that those views are as important as having financial links to a company that manufactures products and therefore will financially gain from your emphasis of the importance of that product relative to another product. But I'm by no means suggesting that this is going to be easy, because whereas financial competing interests can be quantified in a sense, so that certain institutions regard gifts from the pharmaceutical company to a medical researcher under $10,000 American per year as being insignificant. But if you were to receive $10,000 and one, you would be required to disclose that. That might have implications for the regard that you're given as an expert. But it is, in a sense, kind of quantifiable. With non-financial interests, like things like political or religious views, which can be sensitive, it exists much more in a continuum. So where do you stop? Where do you start? I think a really good example to support your criticism is something that happened to me a couple of days ago, where we had published a paper on last Tuesday from a known pro-tobacco control researcher, very high-profile guy in America, heads the probably preeminent research institute on tobacco control, gets all his money from governmental organizations that fund tobacco control. His research has consistently shown, like millions of others of pieces of data have shown, that tobacco is harmful to health. But nevertheless, he does not declare any competing interests when he publishes his work. So we received a sort of rapid response letter to the editor electronically from somebody who admittedly was from a pro-industry group. But even if it had come from somebody neutral, I think the criticism is one we need to take, which is, if somebody's entire career involves doing research that shows that different types of tobacco products are harmful to health, he or she may have a competing interest in that more and more of that research is going to garner them more and more research funding in order to develop their career. In the same way, perhaps, that somebody who does drug trials that show that there might be a benefit to drug A over drug B will get more research funding from people who are interested in seeing if drug A might work better. So I think that's tricky, because if we start down the path where we're require everybody to say, well, my competing interest is that I want to do research in my field that raises research questions that need to be answered by people like me and therefore require funding, then we're probably going a bit too far. But where we draw the line, I think, is something that you're raising that's really, really important. At the same time, I don't agree with you that your political views, if they are relevant to a piece of work that you're trying to publish in a journal, should go undeclared.
But do you think there's a difference between a political or religious or moral or ethical view which you happen to hold privately, possibly strongly, and one which you actually advocate publicly by being a member of some organisation? Do you think that you don't think there is a difference? Would you think there is a difference?
I don't, not necessarily. In the same way that as journals, as editors, we are empowered to say this piece of work was not conducted ethically. This piece of human subjects research was not conducted ethically, despite the fact that some research ethics board gave it its stamp of approval.
My problem is more practical. It means that doing a review involves much more time, and making all sorts of statements that are not, say, in the heart of the reason why I choose for not being a sociologist or whatsoever. So then I think that somebody else should do it. So it would ultimately limit the pool of potential reviewers.
You're quite right when you say reviewing is an altruistic act and we offend reviewers at our peril. I think editors know that. Yes, you have a question. And then Mr. Pompey.
So my name is Suleiman Adibouali, and I'm part of a small independent research group. Before then, I did quite a lot of work with a research organization based in Dakar, Senegal, the Council for Development of Social Science Research in Africa. And one of the critical elements we noticed while we're there is that, and this is where the presentation about the policy guidelines is so critical, is that how do you tackle cases of when entities other than private corporations, other than individuals, when they commit some of the less serious crimes which you talked about, and the less serious crimes are critical. In the case of our research and the work we've done, is that, for example, if you pick international financial institutions, for example, and the structural adjustment program and development policies that were embarked on in Africa and were substantiated and were based on certain research that were promoted and propagated, despite the fact that from available research on the ground done by quite a lot of people, both Africans and non-Africans, that have shown otherwise, they were selectively ignored in advocating this particular research promoted by IFIs. And after embarking on policies, forcing government to embark on policies which led to the pauperization of millions of people, about 4 years ago, they've now turned back to say they were wrong. But interestingly, they've come back to say they are wrong. They are not saying we are wrong based on available research that we have seen that has been done previously that we ignored. They were wrong that we've conducted new research and these things are now wrong. So and another issue that is also gaining a lot of discourse in Africa is about HIV/AIDS research policies and how they link, and how when juggernaut multilateral organizations spend billions and billions of dollars in HIV/AIDS policies and research and all of that view, and how they just want to systematically stifle what they do not regard, research they do not regard as in line with their mandates to tackle HIV/AIDS research. You know, it's how do you, when you create policies and guidelines in systems which we are trying to do, which is very, very important, how do you incorporate questions around the role of IFIs and other bigger entities and institutions beyond individuals and beyond corporate, private, the enemy that we know, because we are facing the so-called do-gooders here, the whole development agency framework and everything.
I'm very grateful to you for that. You know, we were disappointed by the fact that Dr. Morovi, who was meant to be one of our contributors, at the last minute had to cancel through ill health, and that was very much going to be the area that I had hoped he was going to address. So I'm very grateful to you for bringing that up. I must say editors are very aware of, if I can call it academic colonialism, and we're very aware of the fact that many of the papers that come to us which involve projects that have been parachuted into Africa from outside, often have attached to them ethical practices that are dubious, to say the least. Does anyone want to take on this topic? Yes, Dr. Pompidou, do you want to follow that? Yeah, I just want to see if anyone wants to.
I just want to say it's just extremely important, and just underlines, you know, going from what we are talking about as editors and into the policy field, which is should also be very concerned about the things we're talking about now. How do they pick the pieces of information that they use in the policy making?
And certainly I think that as editors we demand as high, well actually higher, ethical standards from large funding organisations that do their work in poor countries than we would elsewhere, because I think we share your anxieties, very much so. Laurel.
One thing I would add is that there is some good social science work that's being done on how, within anthropology and within science technology studies, how do you work with groups of people that live in a location in the U.S. We study indigenous groups of Native Americans, and how do you work with the indigenous group in a way that is going to be beneficial is a broader ethical question than just misconduct. And I think it's just crucial, and it's